to the last time that either you or someone close to you, a daughter or sister, was pregnant and expecting a child. Think about all of the preparation that went into that, the preparing for the birth of this child. Think about how, the mom read a lot of books about childbirth and child rearing, and painted the nursery and picked out a crib, had a baby shower, bought clothes, washed blankets, stocked up on diapers, created a detailed birth plan for the hospital, right? I got that. Didn't go as planned, but I had the plan. Think about all of that preparation that we do for a birth. And yet for a death, there is none of this preparation. Even though we know that death is inevitable for us all, we don't tend to prepare for death. So I just want to take an aside. Every time I say death is inevitable, we're going to die, or that scripture about, I just want to thank all of you for being willing to come on this journey with me the past 4 weeks that we've been talking about death. I just appreciate your willingness to, like you have a choice, right? But you don't have to come, and you keep coming to listen to it. And so I just appreciate everyone's openness, and I know it can be an uncomfortable topic. And that's okay. It's okay for us to talk about things that make us uncomfortable. So most spiritual traditions see birth and death as two sides of the same coin. And yet, as I mentioned, births are prepared for, anticipated with joy, and celebrated, while deaths are often avoided, not talked about, suppressed by our society's taboos, hidden away in darkness, fear, and denial. This unwillingness to look at death or talk about death affects both the way we die in this culture, and it affects the way we live. The spiritual master Eckhart Tolle said, "A culture that denies death inevitably becomes shallow and superficial, concerned only with the external form of things. When death is denied, life loses its depth." And the Mexican author Octavio Paz puts it even more succinctly. "A civilization that denies death ends up denying life." So I'm going to recommend a couple of books for you today, if you could just, And so the first one we're going to talk about is a book called Being Mortal by Dr. Atul Gawande. And in this book, he paints a pretty dire picture of dying in America today. He talks about that the modern medical approach to dying treats death as a syndrome, focusing on treating and alleviating the symptoms and complications that lead up to death. Modern medicine has so many options, so much advanced medicine, that we can prolong death a lot longer now than we could in the past. In the past, death was typically pretty quick, with fewer complications, less protracted. And many folks died at home, surrounded by their loved ones. Today, unless a person is in an accident or has a sudden death, most deaths in our country are very prolonged, and they're medically managed affairs, full of complications and complex treatments. 90% of Americans say that they want to go home. 80% of Americans die in hospitals, nursing homes, or other institutions. And that death involves being hooked up to tubes, being very uncomfortable, in pain, unable to speak, often isolated from their loved ones and surrounded by strangers. The medical model of treating death seems to be concerned with preserving life at all costs for as long as possible, even when it means that there's no quality of life. The other thing is that the medical model provides endless hope, There's always hope that there will be another treatment, that we can live another month, another 6 months. And sometimes it's a false hope that's given to patients and families. And the result of that is that they don't prepare for the death of their loved ones because the doctors keep giving them this hope. And it's not to say that hope that one can live longer is bad, but there's a gap where doctors are not preparing patients and families for the death of the person, so that sometimes when the person does take a turn or they die, people are shocked because they thought Western medicine was going to save them. And so we're not preparing for death the way we need to. The other book I'm going to recommend is called Talking About Death by Virginia Morris. And in the book she says, we've given over our power to the medical industry. We need to take death back to reclaim it. In order to change the way that we die in America, we need to be able to talk about death. So, what stops us from talking about death? First, there's the fear, right? The fear of the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. Many people fear what the end is going to look like. And so for some people, it's simply too frightening to talk about death. There's also a powerful societal taboo on talking about death, and we've been talking about this over the past few weeks. You know, death is not considered polite conversation. You're not supposed to talk about it. It makes people uncomfortable. It makes us uncomfortable. The famous Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's written so many books on death and grief, she says death is the last and greatest taboo in our culture. But you know what? It wasn't always the case. That wasn't always true in American culture. And as we've been looking a little bit over the past weeks, it's not necessarily the case in other cultures. Other cultures are much, I'm not saying all other cultures, but some other cultures, like we've been looking at the Mexican Day of the Dead, are much more comfortable talking about death. And they approach it in a much more frank way, and in the case of the Mexicans, even with irony and humor. So it wasn't always the case that death was such a taboo in our culture, but it has become. Another reason I think it's difficult for us is because we're in denial. Let's face it, right? We figure I'm relatively young and healthy now, so I don't have to think about death. I can think about it later. And then there's superstition. And you wouldn't think that we would still have this because we're modern thinkers, but there is still a superstition. So many people think that if they talk about death and dying, they're going to make it happen to themselves or to others. But in the book, Virginia Morris says, pulling death out from the shadows and examining it in the light does not make death happen. In fact, it does just the opposite. Thinking about death, learning about it, and accepting it makes life happen. So what are the benefits of talking about death? Well, first of all, it can help us to get our priorities straight and to remember what's important in our lives. We get very caught up in the dailiness of life, right? In the material world and all of our concerns. My hair, my clothes, my car, all of these things. And so reminding ourselves that we are mortals can help us remember what's important and begin to live more from that place. We talked about this 2 weeks ago, that when we are aware of our own mortality, we tend to embrace life more fully and remember the preciousness and the fleeting nature of life. It's really easy to think we're going to live forever, especially when you're young. You really think you're going to live forever. And so this reminder of death can help us remember not to squander a single precious moment of life. Talking about death can also help us to find our true purpose. Sometimes we put that off, right? Well, I'll do it later. But when we realize we have limited time, we get more serious about finding what is our calling in this life? What am I here for? And our passions can become more obvious to us. We don't want to wait until later. We want to do that now. Talking about death can also help us to let go of petty resentments and fears and anger, those things that we're holding on to, again, that we put off, I'll deal with that later. when we think about the fact that we're not going to be here forever, it can be a good reminder to us that we need to let some of those things go. Those things that are holding us back from realizing our full potential. Those things that steal our joy. It's not worth letting those things steal our joy because life is fleeting. Talking about death can also really jumpstart our spiritual inquiry. When we think about our own mortality, it causes us to start wanting to ask ourselves questions like, why am I here? What is my purpose? What is all of our purpose? What does it all mean? And as we've seen, people that have a grave illness, who really literally face their own mortality, typically begin seeking spiritual answers. It's very common, right? In fact, for some people, it's totally life-changing. We talked about Vicky's late husband, Rory, who was diagnosed with cancer at 32, and was a huge spiritual awakening for him, and put him on a path that ultimately led him to ministry and to be our minister here. So that brush with death can be very powerful for folks. Often people that have a near-death experience are catapulted onto a spiritual path. Think about our late Dan Schaefer, who loved to talk about his near-death experience because it was such a powerful thing for him, and because he truly felt he made the choice to come back. And so if you've seen what's over there and you make the choice to come back, you want to really get serious about how you spend your time here. And then there's many stories. Some people maybe have read the book Proof of Heaven by Dr. Eben Alexander. It was very popular a few years ago, who was a total atheist non-believer until he had a death experience. And it put him, he was a thinker, a neurologist and everything. It put him onto a spiritual path, and now that is his life's work, and he goes around the world talking to people about that. Facing death head on and talking about it also lessens its power over us, that fear that we feel. If we can get past that superstition that it's going to make it happen, what we can see is that it can help us get over our fear about it. It can help us get more comfortable with the idea of our own mortality, so that that fear doesn't rule our life. We're always going to have some fear about dying because we don't know what happens, right? It's a natural part of being human. But we don't want that fear to keep us up at night. And so it can help to talk about it. It can also be helpful for us to contemplate what our beliefs are about the afterlife. Doing that can help us to clarify our views on life, death, dying, preparing for death, and can help give a context to death in our lives. It can help if we see death as a transition or a passageway to another realm. In fact, most religions see death not as an ending, but a new beginning. How does Unity see death? So, Unity doesn't give any easy answers about death and the afterlife like some religions do. Because we're not concerned with salvation, and we're not concerned with getting to heaven, it's a lot broader and more open, and there's a lot that we have to embrace that mystery. We don't know. We don't know what it's going to be like. We can, imagine, but we don't know. But what we do know in Unity is that all is consciousness. That's what we teach, that everything is consciousness, and therefore nothing perishes, only changes shape. Reincarnation is not an official Unity teaching, but many folks in Unity do believe in some form of reincarnation, and in fact the Fillmores, our co-founders, did believe in reincarnation. So it can be really helpful. In Unity, we tend to think of death as maybe reunification with God, or going back to oneness. And so it can be helpful for us to explore, what is it that we believe about this? Talking about death also provides a powerful opportunity for us to connect with loved ones. After you get over that initial hurdle, being able to talk about death fosters intimacy and connection with those we love. We can get to know them better. The book is amazing. She tells lots of anecdotes, lots of stories, and there are people who really regret not having talked to their husband, grandmother, mother, whatever, not having talked to them about death before that person died. So we don't want to have that regret. When things get down to the wire, people tend to reveal things about themselves, right? And so in these conversations, you find out things about grandma that you never knew, or things about even your spouse that you never knew, when you have these intimate conversations. And in the book, she recommends all kinds of things, but she recommends writing letters to our loved ones, for them to find after our death. She recommends clearing up any misunderstandings that might still be hanging around. Don't let those things go to the grave. Clear them up with those people that you love now. Talking about death also gives us the opportunity to prepare emotionally as well as practically for death. There's something called anticipatory grief. And it may seem counterintuitive, but Dr. Kubler-Ross actually says that anticipating a loss is an important part of experiencing it. So that's when you think about the fact that your loved one is going to die. And we don't want to dwell on this all the time, but it can be beneficial to spend some time thinking about it. It actually helps to prepare for the inevitable. And it can also help us to remember that preciousness of life. This sounds like a silly example, and I don't mean to be flippant or whatever, but when I adore my dog so much, okay, I just love my dog to pieces, and my cats, but I think about the fact that one day he's not going to be there, and I feel that anticipatory grief, as if he's already gone, just for a few moments, right? I feel that pain. And it's not fun, but you know what? It reminds me every single day to appreciate that he's there. And, it's easier to start with our pets than to start with our closest loved ones. We can practice this with our pets, and they're going to die a lot sooner. So that can really help us. And then we don't get completely surprised by that death when it comes. It also gives us an opportunity to make our wishes known to our loved ones, and for them to make their wishes known to us. So a couple of weeks ago, we had a workshop on advanced care directives. Who attended that workshop? It was really great. Again, nobody wants to talk about this stuff, but it's a really good thing. I think those of us that attended really learned a lot. So this woman, Joy Smith, who is a nurse from Chomp, came out and talked to us, and she told us that only 1 in 3 Americans have completed even a basic advanced care directive. And we also learned that that basic advanced care directive is not enough. It's the one typically that lawyers throw in when you're doing a trust, and it's pretty basic. Joy really advocates having a very comprehensive plan for what it is that you want at the end of your life. It needs to be a lot more detailed. And she gave us a couple of scenarios of how things can go, where you realize that you really need to have a lot more plans in place than you think of. The more detail you can have, the better. And the important thing is to talk to your loved ones about this, because just having it in writing is not enough. The person that you've chosen as she called it medical decision maker, needs to really have a good idea of what it is that you want, because that person's going to be making decisions for you. So it made me really realize that we don't have enough plan in our family. Like I, for example, know my mom has always told me she doesn't want heroic measures, she doesn't want to be resuscitated, so I know that about her. But in this workshop, I realized that that's not enough. Just this idea that she doesn't want to be kept artificially alive is not enough detail. I need to know, what does that mean? What if you have to be fed by, what do you call it? A feeding tube. Do you want that? Do you want CPR performed if you crash? What happens if it gets to the point where your body is still functioning but you can't talk? We have to go over all of these scenarios and understand clearly what it is that we want and what it is that our loved ones want. In the book, she talks about the fact that people who had these conversations that can be difficult, but people who had those conversations had a much better chance of having things go the way they wanted when the end came for their loved ones. So it's not just for ourselves, it's for whoever we are tasking with making those decisions for us. That's a huge thing. We want them to have as much information as possible. It's important for us to talk about our fears about death. What is it that we find most frightening? What is it that keeps us up at night? And it can be really powerful to speak those things aloud to a trusted person, you know, a close loved one or friend, your spouse, or it could be a therapist, it could be a clergy member. But when we say those things out loud, it can really take the power out of them. And most of us feel, you know, some existential angst, like we can't imagine what it would be like to not be here, right? When we think about death, it's like, whoa, I can't even, I'm the center of my universe, how can I not be here? You know, and so we imagine that there's more that we have to do, there's more that we want to do, we don't want to miss out on anything. And I think we also fear that unknown, that loss of control. And so we can't alleviate all of our fears by talking about them, but by learning everything we can and talking about it with our loved ones, we can examine those fears that we have, and we can try to address some of them. Some of them are actually addressable. For example, if we have a horrific fear of having a feeding tube placed, then we can make sure that our person that we've chosen as our medical decision maker understands that we don't want that for our end of life. If it comes to that point, we don't want that to happen. And that can alleviate that fear. We know that's not going to happen. So, none of us knows when we're going to die, but we don't want to wait until we are sick, incapacitated or whatever to be making these decisions. Joy talked about that with us in the workshop, that the time to make those decisions and get that stuff down is now. Because when you're already in the crisis, it's much harder to plan these things. So the time to do it is now. And so I invite you to take a picture of that screen. I can also provide the information for you. But Joy Smith is a huge resource. I think people really liked her, right? She was very straightforward. That's her job at CHOMP. You can actually make an appointment and go and talk to her, and she will lead you through this whole thing of thinking about, all the various scenarios and what do I want and not want. And she has a packet of worksheets that helps you. Some of us that were at the workshop, we went through some of it. That really, her job is to help lead you through what can be a complex thing to do, but she can help make it easier. There are flyers back there that you're welcome to take on your way out. She also holds workshops in the community. So if you missed the one at church, there are other ones that she does out in the community that are available. So only by talking about the kind of death we want can we create that situation for ourselves, and can we begin to change the way that we die in America. Most importantly, talking about death can help us to truly live. That fear that we feel can keep us paralyzed, but when we let go of fear, we can begin to take more life-affirming actions. We can get that colonoscopy, get that mammogram that we've been putting off, right? So talking about death can actually lead to a fuller life. We don't want to regret not having talked about it and not having done these things that we need to do. It can also help us to be more daring, to get started on that bucket list, right? Don't wait for later. Let's begin to embrace life more fully now and start to tick those things off that we've always wanted to do. So, Thanksgiving is coming up in a couple of weeks. And it's a very good opportunity for us when we've gathered with our loved ones to start to broach some of these topics. There's actually a national initiative called the Conversation Project, and they have a program called Talking Turkey. And so it's about taking advantage of that time when you're at Thanksgiving to begin to open up these conversations with your loved ones and find out what it is that they want and share with them what you want. They say that we should break bread and taboos. I love that. Breaking bread and breaking taboos. We have to figure out who is that trusted person that we want to charge with making decisions for us, and then talk to them. If this is very difficult for you, you can enlist the help of a clergy member, a therapist, a lawyer, a doctor. You can attend one of these workshops. You can show them this video of this talk. Get this book. There's a lot of resources out there that can help you with this. But approach it, let the person know that this is something that's really important to you, and approach it with love. Let's try to let talking about death not frighten us, but let it help us learn how to fully live our lives, how to fully embrace our fleeting lives and every precious moment. So I'm just going to leave you with the words of Rumi. Every mortal will taste death, but only some will taste life. Now to prepare for a time of meditation, I invite you to just get comfortable. Take a deep breath, relax, let your shoulders fall away from your ears. If it's comfortable, placing your feet flat on the floor, having that grounded posture and connected with the earth. Again, if comfortable, placing your hands on your thighs, palms up, indicating an open and receptive gesture. And just begin to allow your body and mind to get quiet, just for these few precious moments that we have, to just let go of all the outer concerns. All those things will be there when we're finished. We can pick them back up. But just for these few moments, let them go. And bring your attention and focus to that center of your being. Can help to just pay attention to the breath, the gentle rise and fall of the chest and stomach. Feeling yourself with each breath, settling more into the present moment. Knowing that you are safe here in this moment. You are embraced in the loving arms of Spirit. In this place of rest and quiet, all is well. Nothing needs to be changed. just for these moments, embrace life exactly as it is. Everything unfolding in perfect divine order. Nowhere to go and nothing to do, but just practice being. If you tune in, you might be able to feel that aliveness in your hands as you relax them more, letting your fingers unfurl. You can begin to feel that vibration, that life that is so alive in you. That life that lives through you. That heart that beats without you even having to think about it. And the dependable breath flowing in and flowing out. And just allow that breath to come automatically. Breathing in and breathing out. And so I invite you now to just spend a few moments feeling the aliveness in you. That life that lives each one of us. That one power and one presence active in the whole universe. Animating and motivating every living thing. That power that we call good and that we call God. I invite you to just rest for a few moments in that awareness, in silence. Allow the beautiful cooing little sounds of the baby, just reminding us that life is here. We are alive for another moment, for another day. Let us embrace that life fully, for it is truly a miracle that we are blessed to experience today. And for this knowledge, for this truth, we give thanks. And we say, thank you, God. Thank you, God, for my life. So it is. I for you.